Read aloud for chapters 15, 16, and 17. The Contest of the Bow. It was Apollo's feast day, and in the royal palace preparations began at dawn. The old beggar sat unnoticed in a quiet corner of the courtyard and watched the procession of animals and wagons laden with olives and corn file through the city streets. Most of these were taken to the temple to be offered to Apollo in sacrifice, but many in a public sacrifice. But many of the finest cattle, sheep, and swine were set aside and brought to the palace for the enjoyment of the greedy suitors. An unhappy smile crept across the old beggar's lips. If Athena stood by him, their enjoyment would be short-lived. Around noon, the suitors began drifting away from the public ceremony and back to the palace. They gathered in the courtyard just outside the great hall, and soon their laughter filled the air. They were looking forward to the feast, and nobody mentioned the disturbing scenes from the day before. They had been forgotten like a bad dream. As Odysseus watched them from his corner in the shadows, a small group stepped aside from the rest and walked in his direction. It was the inner circle of suitors led by Antinous and Eurymachus. They stopped only a few feet from him and huddled together, conferring in low voices. None of them noticed the old beggar, who sat as still as a stone and heard every word of their plan to murder Telemachus that night, when the whole city would be caught up in festive celebrations. They quickly agreed to the details. Antinous told them what needed to be done. Then they rejoined the main group of suitors and entered the great hall. Odysseus waited long enough for the feast to get underway before following them in. Strong wine was already flowing freely, and he was greeted by a chorus of boos and cheers. "Why, if it isn't our mysterious old friend," said Ctesippus, one of Antinous' cronies. "Here, have a drink, old man." Ctesippus offered Odysseus a bowl of wine. As he stretched out a hand to take it, Ctesippus pulled the bowl aside and poured the contents over his head. Red wine ran down his face and neck, soaking his tattered rags. The hall echoed with the suitors' cheers and laughter. "Here's some food to go with your wine," a voice shouted, and a half-eaten bone hit Odysseus on the shoulder. Soon a shower of missiles came at him from all directions, and pieces of bread, meat, tomato, and olive clung to his skin and clothes. Ctesippus staggered back to his place, doubled up with laughter. Now it was the turn of Leocritus, another from the inner circle, to lead the fun. "Old man, this is the second day you've enjoyed our charity in this hall. It's time you showed us a little gratitude by entertaining us. Come now, old beggar, we know you can eat and drink all night. Now let's see you dance and sing." The suitors shouted and whooped in mock encouragement. Odysseus gazed slowly around the hall, taking each of their flushed, fleshy faces. He did not bother concealing his contempt. "Hurry up, old man," said Leocritus. "There's no need to be coy. If you're suffering from stage fright, perhaps you should have another drink." He picked up a bowl of wine from the table and swaggered toward Odysseus. The other suitors cheered him on, pounding on the tables with their fists. "Enough!" cried Telemachus fiercely. He leaped between Leocritus and his father, grabbed the suitor's wrist, and threw the bowl to the floor. "Aren't you ashamed of yourselves?" he demanded, looking around the hall. "Abusing this poor old beggar so cruelly? Leave him alone and get on with your feast. The next man to disgrace this hall will answer to my sword." The young prince led his father to his own table and set food and wine before him. Now Antinous got to his feet. His face was pale and he shook with rage. "No, Telemachus, it is we who've had enough of this wretched beggar's impudence and your ill-chosen words. This may be your father's palace, but we're your elders and betters, and you should treat us with respect. I'm warning you, young man, if you get in our way, it'll be the worse for you. We'll do as we please, and there's nothing that you or your dear mother can do to stop us." An uneasy silence fell over the hall as Antinous and the young prince stood facing each other. Then Athena, who sat invisible at the far end of the hall, decided to intervene. She mesmerized the suitors, who began laughing and crying uncontrollably. Their faces were twisted and paralyzed, and the roasted meat on their plates turned raw and began bleeding. Odysseus and his son gazed at the scene in amazement. Outside, the afternoon turned black as night, and while tears streamed down the suitors' frozen faces and strangled laughter came gurgling out of their throats, small streams of blood oozed from the corners of their mouths and trickled slowly down their chins. Odysseus spoke and broke the spell. Godless men, can't you see the signs? Your days turned into night, and your bloods began flowing. The suitors returned to their senses, but remembered nothing of the trance. Eurymachus laughed contemptuously at Odysseus. O men of Greece, listen to the prophet speak. Is this the thanks we are getting for our charity? An old fool foretelling our doom? Since he thinks it's so dark in here, let's kick him out into the blazing sun. But before his words had died away, Penelope entered the hall, and the old beggar was forgotten. The queen was dressed in a dazzling robe and was surrounded by 6 maids carrying 12 axes and blocks. Penelope herself carried a quiver full of arrows and a magnificent bow. Arrogant suitors, she began in a trembling voice, your day has come at last. You've wallowed in this house for 4 years now, growing fat on our food and loud and stupid on our wine, and you've given nothing in return. Your excuse has been that you wish to marry me in spite of the fact that my husband might still be alive. Well, here's your chance to win the prize. Whoever can string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through a line of 12 axe heads will take me from the palace as his wife. Good Eumaeus, set the bow down before the suitors, and you, my dear Telemachus, help me arrange these axes as your dear father used to all those years ago. They lined up the blocks and placed the axes in them. The brass rings on the handle tips glistened in the dim light of the hall. The young prince was fired up by the sight of his father's famous son, and the desire to prove himself the young prince was fired up by the sight of his father's famous bow, and the desire to prove himself a worthy son. He flung off his purple cloak, took the bow from his mother, and carried it over to the steps in front of the threshold, where he made a mark for the contestants to stand behind. Then he knelt down and examined the target carefully. The line of axes was straight and true. Telemachus placed the string into the notch at one end of the bow and began bending it with his knees. It was hard work, but he immediately sensed that he would master it. He was interrupted by a dry cough from the shadows behind him, and looking around, he caught his father's warring eye. Telemachus laid down the bow. It seems that I'm still too young and too weak to string my father's bow, he said, walking back to his seat. In any case, this contest is not for me. Come now, mighty suitors, let's see who's man enough to win my mother's hand. A heated argument immediately broke out. To most of the suitors, it seemed a simple enough thing to string a bow and shoot straight. They had whiled away many hours of their 4 idle years in Ithaca with archery competitions, and they could handle a bow and arrow with considerable skill. The difficulty of the present contest, so they thought, lay in getting their hands on the bow in the first place. Since there were more than 100 suitors in all, or there were more than 100 suitors in all, since the first to succeed would win the prize, surely the first to go had the best chance of winning. This certainly made the contest no better than a lottery. It was Antinous who solved the problem. He suggested that they follow the order in which the wine was ceremonially poured. Since Antinous would be the last according to the system, nobody could reasonably object. The other suitors applauded him and praised his generosity. They did not realize that he thought going last gave them the best chance of success. He had quickly seen that this was no ordinary bow and that few of them had a hope of even stringing it, especially as it had gone unused for 20 years. The more it was tried, the more supple it would become. One by one, the suitors stepped up to their mark, and one by one, they returned to their places defeated. Finally, only Eurymachus and Antinous were left. Eurymachus stepped forward first. He attached the string to the bottom notch and used all of his weight to bend the bow down. For a moment, it looked as if he might succeed, but when he got halfway, the bow would bend no more. He struggled until he was red in the face, and the sweat poured off his brow, all to no avail. Cursing under his breech, he flung the bow to the ground, cursing under his breath. Now Antinous stepped forward eagerly, sure to succeed. A bow he could not bend had not yet been made, but the smile soon faded from his lips. He could do no better than any of the others. Unwilling to accept defeat, he asked for grease, which he then worked into the wood to make the bow more supple. When he had warmed it in front of the fire, he tried it again. It still would not bend. Eurymachus tried the bow again without success. The suitors hung their heads, and a sense of despair descended on them all. "We should not be dismayed," said Antinous, anxious to lift the gloom. "Today's the feast day of Apollo, god of archery. No doubt it was foolish of us to think we could bend this bow on a day like this. Let's put it aside and try to win tomorrow. And let's drink to Apollo to win the god's favor." The wine flowed, and within minutes their failure was forgotten. Antinous must be right. It was not the day for archery. The entire time Odysseus sat in the shadows biding his time. He had seen his bow defeat the suitors, and now he was ready to turn it against them. If Athena was on his side, they would never see another day. "Noble lords," he said, stepping out into the center of the hall, "Antinous is right. Apollo's feast day is wrong for such a contest. If he's willing, tomorrow will bring a different result. But I hope no one will object if I try the bow myself. Many years ago, I owned a bow just like this one. It was my pride and joy, and it would give a poor old man harmless pleasure to handle such a bow again." "Insolent old fool," replied Eurymachus angrily. "We should have thrown your rotting carcass to the dogs yesterday, when you first opened your mouth. How can you presume to do what so many strong young men could not? And if by some miracle or freak of nature you were to succeed, do you think the rest of us would suffer the humiliation in silence? You'd be torn apart before you could reach the door. And do you think Penelope would marry a vermin-infested old man like you?" At these harsh words, Penelope rose from her seat and stood at the old man's side. "It makes me laugh, Eurymachus, to hear you speak of humiliation. Where does this sense of honor suddenly spring from? You've managed to hide it well enough for the past 4 years. What makes you want to introduce it now? In any case, this poor old man isn't like you. He doesn't ask to marry me. He merely wants to try my husband's bow. Let him do as he likes. If he succeeds where all you brave young men have failed, then I shall give him rich gifts and fine clothes, so that he had returned to his native land with honor instead of wandering the earth in shame and sorrow until he dies." "My mother's right," agreed Telemachus. "Let the old man have his way. It can do no harm. And now, dear mother, why don't you go over to your room and rest? The contest is over for you today, and you suddenly look tired and withdrawn." Penelope was grateful. She had been under such strain that she was in danger of becoming ill. She left the hall with her maids at her side, glad to have won another day's reprieve. As she made her way upstairs, the old nurse, Euryclea, silently fell behind and bolted the inner doors of the great hall from the outside. Now there was only one way out, across the main threshold. Odysseus walked up to the mark and picked up the great bow. He held it lovingly, running his hands gently over the seasoned willow. It may have hung unused for 20 years, but he could tell at once that it was in perfect condition. The suitors watched him and laughed. Well, sneered Antinous. "I see our old beggar is somewhat a connoisseur of bows. Perhaps he's mesmerizing the design so that he can go away and make one for himself." "He's certainly got more chance of making one than stringing one," said Leocritus. "Oh, come, said Eurymachus. "Can't you see he's a veritable Apollo amongst beggars?" Odysseus ignored the mockery. He tested the bow in his hands, taking his time until it began to feel, once more as it had done all those years ago, like an extension of his own arms and hands. At last he was satisfied, and in a single flowing movement he bent it and strung it and then plucked it like a lyre, so that it sang out as pure and clear as a swallow's song. Before the solitary note had faded in the air, a single peal of thunder came from the heavens in reply. The suitors stared open-mouthed at the beggar as he pulled a long, slender arrow from the quiver at his feet spurred to the lines of axes and aimed. The arrow sped clean through the rings and buried itself quivering in the outside wall. The death of the suitors. There was a stunned silence in the hall. All eyes were on Odysseus. He seized the quiverful of arrows, leaped up onto the steps of the threshold, and turned to face the suitors with Telemachus at his side. Behind them, the great doors were already barred. Then, with the suitors still frozen in their seats, Odysseus aimed again and sent a second arrow flying across the hall. It sank into Aeneas' throat. The cruel suitor fell crying to the ground, blood spurting from the wound. Immediately the hall was in an uproar. The suitors shouted angrily at the beggar. They had killed the noblest lord in Ithaca, and he would pay for it with his life. He killed the noblest lord in Ithaca, and he would pay for it with his life. But when they turned to the walls for weapons, they saw to their dismay that they had all been removed. They looked back at the beggar with their bow, and their hearts began trembling. It seemed to them that the old man in rags had turned into a god. Perhaps he was Apollo himself. You slavering dogs, said Odysseus. You are right to cower and cringe with fear, for the lion has returned. You thought I was gone forever and that you could do what you wanted in my house. If I'd come here with dignity and honor, I'd gladly have forgotten you, and you'd have welcomed my return. But you've lived a life of idle luxury and shame at my expense. You've terrorized my family and my servants and mocked their suffering. You've lived as cruel cowards, and you'll die as dogs. Noble Odysseus, listen to me, please, broke in Eurymachus in a smooth, pleading voice. Listen before you start a bloodbath in your hall. It's true, we behaved badly and have done things we regret. But what can you expect from high-spirited young men? Remember that you were once young yourself. Besides, the worst culprit is already dead, lying in his own blood at your feet. It was Antinous who wanted to kill your son and take over your kingdom for himself. He was an evil man, and we were afraid of him. He deserved to die. Let the rest of us make amends. We'll repay double what we've taken here. Odysseus let out a bitter laugh. Eurymachus, even if you gave me everything you have, that still wouldn't be enough. You're a liar and a thief, like the dead dog at your feet, and neither you nor anyone else will leave this hall alive. When he heard these words, Eurymachus realized they would have to fight their way out. Now, instead of pleading, he snarled back at Odysseus. Arrogant fool, you don't stand a chance. There are more than 100 of us here, and we have followers all over the city. You only have your puny son and that obstinate old swineherd. What a pity that you should have come home at last, only to die in your own hall. Eurymachus ran straight at Odysseus with his sword raised above his head. The arrow passed clean through his heart and stopped him dead. He collapsed sideways across the table, and his dark blood mingled with spilled red wine as it dripped onto the floor. The suitors rushed toward the threshold, their swords drawn and holding tables in front of them to shield against the rain of deadly arrows. They shouted and cursed to give themselves courage. But Odysseus and his son stood firm with Athena watching over them. The goddess made sure that every arrow hit its mark and gave Telemachus extra strength as he held the suitors off with spear and sword. When the arrows had run out, father and son stood side by side and cut a swath through the suitors, whose corpses piled upon the marble floor. Meanwhile, Eumaeus, who had been hurling javelins past Odysseus and his son into the advancing mass, caught sight of his old enemy Melanthius, struggling to open one of the inner doors at the far end of the hall. With a fierce cry, he dashed toward him and drove a spear through his body and deep into the door beyond. The goatherd writhed like a harpooned fish, and Eumaeus left him there to die slowly, while the suitors, who could not save him now, were slaughtered before his eyes. It did not last long. Athena was with them, and no one could resist. Father and son rested on their swords and paused for breath. More than 100 corpses lay around them. Odysseus was covered from head to foot in blood and gore. He looked around and caught sight of 2 figures crouched behind one of the tables, partly concealed by the pile of bodies. So, 2 of the cowardly suitors thought that they could escape his vengeance. He went toward them, sword raised, ready to finish his bloody task. A feeble figure crawled out from under the table and clasped him by the knees. It was Phemius the bard. Once Odysseus had loved this man for his music and song, but now he was ready to kill him, for he had found him with the suitors. As he raised the blood-stained sword above his head, Telemachus grasped him by the arm. "No, father, spare him. I'd sooner you killed me first. He's as innocent as the hills and trees. When the suitors came, he wanted to leave rather than think for them. It was I who persuaded him to stay. I told him that one day you'd surely return and that he should be here to welcome you with his song." While Telemachus spoke, the other figure emerged and knelt before them. It was Medon the page. "Get up, Medon, you have nothing to fear. My father is vengeful, but he's also fair. When I tell him how you looked after me in childhood and protected me from the scheming suitors for so long, I'm sure he will reward you with his love and not his sword." "My son is right," agreed Odysseus, smiling now. "Medon and Phemius, I see that you have been dear friends to him, as you always were to me. Later, we'll sit together and talk about old times. But now let's clear these bodies out of the hall and wash this blood away." They called for Euryclea and the maids, who unbolted the inner doors and entered the hall. The old nurse rejoiced when she saw what had happened, but Odysseus restrained her. Bloodshed and death were no cause for celebration. The maids were sickened by the carnage that met their eyes. Some wept bitter tears, for the men who had become their lovers lay among the dead. It took them a long time to empty the hall. Odysseus was anxious to conceal what had happened until he had time to prepare the situation. For many of the suitors had family and friends in the city. They carried the bodies through a side door into the rear courtyard, where Medon and Eumaeus burned them on a fire. The smell of burning flesh would cause no comment on a great feast day, where the city air was heavy with the smell of sacrificial fires. When at last they had cleared the hall and scraped and scrubbed it clean, Odysseus sent the old nurse to fetch his wife. She found her in a deep and dreamless sleep, and shook her hard to wake her. Penelope thought that the old nurse had gone mad. "Old Euryclea, how can what you say be true? My husband was a great man, but even he could not have stood alone against so many." However, to humor her, Penelope went down with her to the hall. When she saw Odysseus, she stepped back in amazement, trembling and pale. Her husband stood before her exactly as she remembered him. It was as though his 20 years' absence had been nothing but a dream. "Dear mother," said Telemachus, "are you so heartless that you have nothing to say to my father, who has come home after so much time and so much suffering?" "Dear son, I can't believe my eyes. This must be some god who wears my husband's shape and form. I dare not believe after so long that it's really him. My heart aches and my mind is numbed at the sight of him. Go, Telemachus, and all the rest of you. Leave us alone here. If this is indeed Odysseus, then I shall soon know him for myself." Now, husband and wife were alone. Still trembling, Penelope approached Odysseus. She ran a hand down his leg and found the scar she knew so well. Then she looked up at him and spoke. "Odysseus, unlucky wanderer, can it really be you? Should I tell the maids to bring out our bed and make it up once more? When you left me 20 years ago, I had it put away until your return." Odysseus drew back angrily. "What do you mean you moved the bed? I made that bed myself inside our room. I made the frame from seasoned ash, dovetailed the joints, and inlaid the wood with silver, ivory, and gold. The bed was much bigger than the door, and no one could have moved it out without cutting it up." Penelope threw her arms around his neck and kissed and stroked his face in wonder. "Odysseus, my love, don't be angry with me. No one has moved our bed. I had to be sure it was really you and not some god who'd come to deceive me and steal my love. But now that I'm sure of you, I could happily die in your sweet arms." Tears streamed down both of their faces as they embraced. After 20 long years of separation, they held each other once again. For a long time, they kissed and stared into each other's eyes and did not say another word. Then they walked arm in arm to their room, where they found their bed already made up with bowls of fruit and wine laid out beside it. The bright-eyed Athena suspended time that night until they had loved and talked and slept their fill, and when at last dawn came, it found them lying happy in each other's arms. Odysseus the King. News of the suitors' deaths had spread throughout the city. All night rumors had been rife, and by dawn it was confirmed. There was a shocked and stormy gathering in the assembly place. Hundreds of Ithacans had lost relatives or friends. Eupeithes, father of Antinous, argued passionately for revenge. Fellow citizens, he declaimed through tears of grief and anger, look what this king of ours has done to this people. 20 years ago, he left with 12 ships and the flower of Ithacan youth. They were lost to us forever. Now he has returned to kill a second generation, our sons and the sons of our brothers and cousins, left behind when they sailed for Troy. We must avenge them and rid our people of this scourge, Odysseus. Fellow Ithacans, take up your arms and follow me. It was old Halitherses, friend of Telemachus, who answered him. No, my friends, we must not blame Odysseus for the death of these young men. We ourselves are to blame. We let them do as they pleased until they were beyond our control, terrorizing the country and making up their own laws as they went along. It was the gods who decided that they should die. It can do no good to attack Odysseus now. It will only bring more death and suffering, and we've suffered enough. Many of them agreed with these wise words, but there were just as many who were bent on revenge. Shouting down the rest, they brandished their swords and spears and marched to the palace with Eupeithes at the lead. Cries of death to Odysseus echoed through the streets, shattering the early morning peace. Outside the palace gates, Odysseus and Telemachus stood waiting. Athena stood beside them, wrapped in an invisible mist, as they watched the angry mob approach. It was Eupeithes who led the charge. He raised his spear and ran at Odysseus with a blood-curdling yell, but he never reached him. A sudden thunderbolt came from the sky and struck him to the ground. At once, Athena stepped forward out of the mist, dressed in gleaming gold. The Ithacans dropped back in awe. Good men of Ithaca, my father Zeus has spoken. Let this death be the last. There's been too much bloodshed in this land. Odysseus has returned and justice has been done. Now, you should make your peace, remember the dead, and welcome Odysseus home. And you, said Athena, turning to Odysseus, should put down your sword, forgive those who forgive you, and earn your people's love. Athena was right. There had already been too much bloodshed. Odysseus went among his people and embraced them, weeping from both sorrow and joy. After, back at the palace, he asked for a great feast of Thanksgiving to be prepared. Then he went out with Penelope beside him to look for his old father Laertes at the farm in the hills. They found him bent sadly over his hoe. His garden was taken care of, but Laertes himself looked wasted and disordered. When he saw Odysseus, he fainted. For a moment they thought that shock had killed him. Happily, he soon recovered, and after many tears and fond words, he went back with them to the palace. It was a memorable feast. Most of Ithaca had somehow squeezed into the great hall. There was a great deal of sorrow, for so many had died, but there was also great joy, for everyone felt that a time of peace and happiness had come. At long last, after 20 years, Odysseus and Penelope sat together by the fire with their people all around them. There was great wonder too, for after they had eaten and drunk to the gods and the memory of their dead, they clamored for Odysseus to tell his story. Then they listened spellbound to every adventure as he told them of the lotus eaters and the Cyclops, of Circe and Hades, and of the Sirens and Calypso, of gods and goddesses, and of much, much more. It was a story they would hear again many, many times, and one they would discuss endlessly among themselves. It was a story to cherish for as long as they lived. The end.